My name is Sean Farrell and I'm a data scientist hailing from Brisbane, Australia, so I literally had to fly through a cyclone to get here. I'm very, very pleased to be here today. Okay, so traditional scouting in both basketball and in pretty much any other sport has focused on physiological, as in metrics that are measured through, for example, draft combines, and performance metrics, for example, box scores. Now, the advantages of this is that data is readily available, going back decades, so it's really good for benchmarking. And NCAA statistics have been shown to be significant predictors of future performance in the NBA. The cons are that physiological stats from draft combines have been shown to provide limited predictive signal when it comes to predicting success, and that data on prospects can be very limited. For example, freshmen and international prospects, you can't compare them. So that raises a question for us: how important is mindset and psychology in sport? Anecdotally, every coach and athlete I've spoken to has given me a number between 50 and 90%. Very high, but the problem is they don't measure it. And the reason is lack of data. And the lack of data has provided significant barriers due to limited access to athletes. They're time poor. Getting them to sit down for traditional assessments is unlikely. The time required to complete assessments is quite laborious. A few hours for a traditional 600+ word or point questionnaire. And the limitations of self-reporting. When you're asking someone to fill out a questionnaire, they know they're being assessed and will try to give you the answer that they think you want to hear. So accuracy is an issue. So the project goals for this research paper: 1, develop psychology-based methods for talent identification. 2, combine psychological and performance metrics. And 3, build models to predict which college basketball players will make it onto an NBA team roster, and that's both draft and not drafted, so signed post-draft, and in forecasting their career duration in terms of number of games played, and their career impact in terms of number of games they'll be in the starting lineup. To do this, we took 25,000 plus post-game college basketball interviews from ASAP Sports, NCAA player performance stats, including height, weight, age, and college conference from realgm.com, and NBA draft records. And the techniques we used include psychology metrics extracted from language using a framework called Luke, light GBM machine learning algorithm, and survival analysis techniques. So to give you a bit of a background on Luke, Luke is the cornerstone of the work we did, the primary features and the focus of this paper, and it stands for Linguistic Inquiry and Word Count. It extracts psychological metrics from natural language, and scores are, it's a dictionary-based method, so scores are percentage of total words in each category. There are 117 linguistic plus psychological measures that are extracted by Luke, and this was developed by one of my co-authors, Professor Jamie Pennebaker, on 30 years plus of social psychology research. Now, the focus of Luke is on a group of words called function words. These are unconsciously used. They're 1% of our vocabulary, but 50% plus of our word usage. These are the syntactically important words. It's not context, it's not verbs and nouns, it's the joining words that you just use without thinking. And these provide insights into your mindset. So essentially, it's not what you say, but how you say it that's important. And it's very difficult to consciously manipulate and doesn't require exhaustive assessment. So to give you a demo of Luke in action, this is an excerpt from an interview with Jason Tatum in 2017 when he was playing for Duke University, post-game interview. There are 100 words in this sample. If we look at the pronouns, we count them up, we have 14 pronouns, so it's a pronoun score of 14%. Conjunctions, these are joining words. There are 12 of those, 12% score. And there are 4 words that relate to a temporal focus on the present, so we have a present focus score of 4%. So in terms of statistical techniques, we use a light GBM machine learning model to build binary predictors to predict which players will make it onto an NBA team roster. It's a gradient-boosted ensemble decision tree technique where each iteration learns from the mistakes of the one prior using gradient descent. It's very fast, highly accurate, and can handle imbalanced data through the use of weights. So it's perfect for this application. We use survival analysis to forecast career duration and career impact. And survival analysis techniques were developed in medicine to forecast patient survival timeframes. They produce time to event probability predictions. And data points that haven't yet reached the event, in terms of this, we're talking about end of career, can still be used to constrain the models using a method called censoring. And we can use multivariate data to boost predictive performance. So, how do we do? where we built 4 binary predictor models using LightGBM. The first one, using just the psychology or Luke metrics, achieving a balanced accuracy of 63%. That's compared to a baseline of 55%. So it's a significant performer. So the answer is yes, we can use psychology to predict performance and future success in the NBA. Building a model just from the physical performance features, NCAA box scores, we achieve a 78% accuracy. Now, if we combine them, we get to 83%. So again, the combination of physical and psychological metrics does provide a predictive boost and improves our models. And if we add in additional features such as age, height, weight, and college conference, we can get to 87%. Some of these are not so useful. We know that if you're over 22, you're less likely to get drafted. If you're over 2 meters tall, you're more likely to get drafted. And if you're playing in a top level conference, then you're obviously going to have a better chance as well. Okay, so what drives the models? We have a feature importance plot here, which shows how important each feature is, with a higher gain meaning more important. And the physical features are highlighted here, draft age being the number 1 feature, conference and height being up there as well in the top 50. This is our NCAA performance stats, dominated by things like floor impact, points scored, win percentage. And then we have our psychology features rounding out the top 50. And to focus on a couple of these, conjunctions is the most important Luke feature. Conjunctions measures the joining words. So the joining words in sentences, they measure how complex the language usage is. More complex language usage indicates a more analytical, deeper thinking style, but slower decision making. And what we see here on these partial dependency plots is as the score for Luke score on the x-axis increases, the probability that the model assigns to being successful goes down. So more complex language, deeper thinking style, slower decision making, less likely to make it onto an NBA team roster. In contrast, we have present focus score on the bottom plot. And as you increase the score of present focus, the more likely you are to make it onto an NBA team roster. And present focus is related to mindfulness, and we believe is an indication of the ability to achieve flow state. So the more likely you are to achieve flow state, the more mindful you are, the more likely you are to make it onto an NBA team roster. Here are some survival analysis Kaplan-Meier curves. This is not using any of the features I've just mentioned. This is purely looking at the actual draft status from first round, second round, and not drafted. And what we see is that the NBA draft seems fairly efficient. First round draft picks tend to play more games than players who were drafted late in the second round or not drafted at all. But there is overlap between some of these groupings, which indicates there is an edge to be gained. If we look at the concordance indexes, so a concordance index or a C index is an indication of how well the model performs. A value of 0.5 indicates it's similar to flipping a coin. So with a score of 1 meaning a perfect model. So a score of 0.7 is a significantly performing model. And that's just from the performance model, so NCAA stats only. If we throw in age, height, weight, and conference, we push it up to 78%. And then again, adding in the psychology features, the Luke features, we get to 81%. So that's a very well-performing survival analysis model. Similar for forecasting career impact in terms of number of games in the starting lineup. Again, we see the draft is fairly efficient, but there is some overlap and some edge to be gained. And very similar plots to the other ones with slightly different numbers. 71% for NCAA model, 80% for NCAA plus age, height, weight, conference, and 82% when you add in the psychology features. Now, just to focus on a few individual players, I would say picked at random, but they weren't. We'll start with Al Horford. Now, the psychology performance model and the combined models all agreed he had a high probability of making it onto an NBA team roster, and indeed he was picked 3rd in 2007. Craig Brackens, the Luke model predicted a low probability, less than 50% of him making it onto a roster. NCAA model, however, predicted 84%, and the combined model split the difference. He was picked up, 21st pick in 2010. And then finally, Chris Middleton. The psychology model predicted he had a better than even chance of making it. The stats model said less than even, and the combined model, again, less than 50%. And if we look at where they actually ended up, Al Horford, 1,301 games and counting, 1,241 starts and counting, Highly successful player. All the models absolutely smashed it. Craig Brackens, 17 games, 1 start before he left the NBA. He underperformed significantly compared to what his physical stats in college suggested. And Chris Middleton, 841 games and counting, 737 starts and counting, significantly overperformed compared to what his physical statistics from college basketball suggested. These are the couple of Meyer curves for the 3, and you can see that backs that up. Al Horford and Chris Middleton both had high probabilities of making it to 500 games and even to 1,000. Craig Brackens, the model suggested, would be lucky to play more than 100. And again, for starts, Horford, Middleton, both predicted to have high probability of starting in over 500 games, and Brackens very unlikely to start in more than a few. So just to finish up, I hope I've convinced you that psychology can actually add signal to your decision-making process when it comes to recruitment in sport. I focused on basketball, but there's no reason why this can't be applied to any other sport where language can be collected. Baseball, football, hockey, Australian rules football, soccer, whatever your sport is, can be used for it. We can also use this for assessing the likelihood of scholarship applicants going pro. This might be of interest in the college space. And we can actually interpret some of these psychology features to provide insights into traits related to performance. For example, competitiveness, coachability, grit, resilience, leadership, and clutch performance. We can also monitor metrics related to athlete mental health. We believe we can measure organizational culture and therefore cultural fit. And finally, and possibly the most interesting, it's possible that we can actually use this to predict injury. This is one that we haven't tested, but the theory is that we should be able to use measures such as cognitive load and self-focus to predict the likelihood of a player becoming injured. And if anyone here is interested in exploring this further, please get in touch. I'd love to chat. And that's it for me. Thank you.
I think you did a good job. I really like the second slide when you broke down like one of the cons to where you talked about limited data when it comes to international players and freshmen, because if you think about it, you know, whenever there's an NBA lottery, there are 14 picks. If you probably go back the last 5 years, most of those players are either like international players or like freshmen out of college. The one question that I wanted to ask is, and if you already touched on this and I just missed it, my apologies, but determine success, because you talked about like success, because it's easy to quantify when you talk about longevity. There are 82 games in the NBA season, how many years, et cetera, but I think there could be like levels to success. So just, if you don't mind just breaking that down to me, like what would you quantify that as?
Sure, great question. The way we defined success in this case was making it onto an NBA team roster, regardless of whether they actually played any games, but they were signed by an NBA team to play basketball for the NBA. Doesn't matter if they were drafted in the first round, second round, or not drafted and picked up after the summer league. We consider that to be success.
Okay, thank you.
It's really interesting, and I'm now very self-conscious about the number of conjunctions I'm using in this sentence, but maybe that's okay, or maybe not. I think I just put 4 in there. My question is, when you get the language, so did you run this on language samples from interviews that they have now, or language samples at the time they were drafted, and does that make a difference?
Yes, very good question. I should have clarified that. These are all pre-draft interviews in the time up, not even including on the draft night. So each of these players had no idea whether or not they would be drafted or signed, and that's important because although context is less important than you would think, people are happier and more positive about things if they know that they've just got their dream job. So we wanted to take out the possibility of that impacting on the results, and so all the interviews we used pre-draft, which means that we don't have baselines on players like LeBron, because he didn't play college basketball, Kobe didn't play, and we don't have Michael Jordan either, because the data set goes back to 1992, and he was obviously drafted in the 80s, so yeah.
In this vein, same there's a causation problem potentially, because known pro prospects are going to get different questions and they're going to have different conversations with, and so they're, for example, one of your most important features was like future focus, something like that. And so they're answering questions on, hey, you know, your pro career.
Yeah, that's a really good question. While context is important, it does have some ability to shift the scores. It actually doesn't really matter what you're being asked as much, because they're being asked about their performance. They're all championship players in championship games. Sometimes they win, sometimes they lose. Similar sort of questions being asked overall, but again, it's the function words, and it's very, very hard to manipulate. So you could still be having the same number of conjunctions no matter what you've been asked to talk about. So I don't think there's so much of an issue with causation here. Even if we wanted to remove the possibility of that, not knowing that not knowing that they've actually succeeded yet, but the reality is that the scores don't change too much pre or post draft.
One more quick follow-up. Is there useful information in social media?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. I have a student project that I supervised a few years ago where we looked at Twitter feeds from athletes, from verified accounts from 7 different sports, and we looked at, could we just simply predict who's a professional athlete versus not? Very high, it's like 98% probability or accuracy of predicting who's an athlete. They look very different to normal people, extremely motivated, and that really stands out. We also looked at, can we predict individual versus team sports? We can. There's an affiliation focus feature in there that really is very strong for team sport players, very low for most individual sport players. And we tried to predict which sport they were actually playing for. And we could do with like 7 sports, it was 43-44% accuracy with a 13% baseline. It was really good. And there's some interesting demographic things we pulled out of that as well, which I can go into if you want to have a chat later. But the problem with social media is you don't actually know who's actually writing their things, and that's the problem with social media. And that's why I prefer working with interviews where you know who's speaking. Thank you.